The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow over the jagged mountains of northern Mexico. The dry wind carried the scent of dust and diesel, rustling through the skeletal remains of a once thriving border town. It was the kind of place people passed through, not the kind they stayed in. The airfield, a relic of another time, sat on the outskirts, its cracked tarmac stretching like an abandoned memory, the faded hangar doors creaking with every gust. Inside a dimly lit, makeshift cantina near the airstrip, men whispered over half-empty glasses of tequila. A radio crackled in the corner, murmuring an old ranchera song while a ceiling fan turned lazily, doing little to fight the oppressive heat. Shadows clung to the corners, thick with tension, as a handful of figures exchanged quiet glances. Conversations stopped when the door creaked open. An old man stepped inside, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. His presence commanded a strange mix of dismissal and unease. To most, he was just another washed-up pilot, his hair silvered with age, his once powerful frame now worn down by years of flight and solitude. A relic, like the rusting aircraft that lined the airstrip outside. But those who had been around long enough knew better than to judge a man by his years. Gabriel Hawk Dawson did not belong here. Not really. He had come to this place out of necessity, not choice. Flying cargo was all he knew, all he had left. It was a simple job. No questions, no attachments. But in this part of the world, nothing was ever truly simple. He moved toward the bar, his steps measured. The bartender, a wiry man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, set down a glass before Hawk could even ask. "Long flight?" the man asked, eyes flickering with something unreadable. Hawk exhaled. "Long enough." His voice was low, weathered, carrying the weight of places he had seen and men he had outlived. Across the room, a group of younger men sat hunched around a table. They were not drinking. They were watching. Hawk felt their eyes on him before he even turned. A lifetime in, war had honed his instincts to razor precision. He did not need to look to know the type. Young, impatient, dangerous in the way only those who had never seen real war could be. Their clothes were too new, their knives too clean. Their arrogance was the kind that came from power handed down. Unearned, cartel boys, he had been expecting them. The tension in the air thickened. One of them, a lanky figure with a tattoo creeping up his neck, leaned toward his companion, muttering something under his breath. A slight smirk played at the edge of his mouth. The others chuckled softly, but their eyes never left Hawk. He ignored them. He had spent his life walking away from fights that were not worth his time. But something about the way they laughed, the way they looked at him like he was already dead, gnawed at him. "That is him," one of them finally said, just loud enough to be heard. Hawk took a slow sip from his glass. He did not react, not yet. He waited. The bartender shifted uncomfortably. "Careful, viejo," he muttered, low enough that only Hawk could hear. Hawk set his glass down. He met the bartender's eyes, and for a brief second something unspoken passed between them. It was not concern. It was recognition. "You know who they work for?" Hawk asked, keeping his voice even. The bartender hesitated. Then, with the slightest nod, he confirmed what Hawk already suspected. It was not just any cartel. It was them. Hawk exhaled, slow and measured. He had been avoiding this moment for years, keeping his head down, staying off their radar. But fate had a cruel sense of humor. He turned slightly, just enough to meet the gaze of the tattooed one. The kid grinned, flashing gold teeth. "Nice night, old man," he said, his Spanish slow, deliberate. "Must be hard flying those old planes, yeah? Hands do not shake too much?" The others snickered. Hawk held his gaze. The kid had no idea who he was talking to. "No," Hawk said simply. A pause. The kid's grin faltered for half a second. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You fly for us now," he said, like it was already decided. The room went silent. Hawk stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly, he stood. The chair scraped against the floor as he pushed it back, the sound sharp in the quiet. The kid's smirk widened. "Problem?" he taunted. Hawk did not answer. He just turned, walking toward the exit, his pace steady. The air had shifted. He could feel it. He had made it 2 steps before the voice came again, this time lower. "I said..." Hawk stopped. For the first time, he let the room feel the weight of who he really was. Not the old man, not the cargo pilot, but him. The silence was heavy now, the kind that made men sweat. The kid's bravado wavered, but it was too late. Hawk turned just slightly, his voice quiet, lethal. "I am not for sale." The kid hesitated. Then he scoffed, but there was something uneasy in his eyes now. "You do not have a choice, viejo." Hawk smiled. Just a flicker, a shadow of something cold. "You should hope I do," he said. Then he walked out. Behind him, the tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. The kid swore under his breath. Someone stood abruptly, knocking over a chair. The bartender exhaled, shaking his head. Outside, the desert night stretched endless and empty, the stars sharp against the black sky. Hawk stepped onto the tarmac, the wind whispering against his skin. His old cargo plane sat waiting, its metal frame gleaming under the dim lights. He had been running for a long time, but something told him. This time, there would be no running. Far behind him, a single gunshot echoed into the night. The night air was thick with dust and the scent of gasoline. As Hawk Dawson walked toward his plane, the battered cargo aircraft stood like an old warhorse, its metal frame reflecting the dim glow of the hangar lights. He ran his fingers along the fuselage, feeling the ridges of rivets beneath his calloused hand. This plane was more than just a machine. It was a lifeline. And now, it might also be a trap. The echoes of the gunshot behind him had not settled yet. He could still hear it ringing in his mind, a distant reminder that his past had finally caught up. Hawk exhaled slowly, letting the desert wind cut through his jacket. He had been through worse. Much worse. As he climbed into the cockpit, he reached for the control panel, his hands steady. The kid in the cantina had been cocky, arrogant, a child playing at war. Hawk had seen his kind before. Men who had never truly fought for their lives. Men who confused brutality with strength. They had no idea who he was, but they would find out. Hawk leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a brief moment. The scent of oil and aged leather filled the small cockpit, mixing with something older. Memories buried deep beneath the surface. Vietnam, 1969. The jungle had been alive that night, whispering with danger. The roar of the Blackhawk's rotors had barely drowned out the screams on the radio. He had been younger then, faster, reckless, the kind of pilot that men whispered about in awe and fear. Hawk, they had called him. Not just because of his name, but because he could see danger before it struck. And that night he had seen it coming. The LZ had been a trap. The enemy had waited in the shadows, their gunfire tearing through the canopy like lightning. His co-pilot, Jake, had shouted something, but Hawk had already been moving, banking the chopper hard, pushing the engines to their limits, racing against death itself. He had saved those men that night, but not all of them. Jake had not made it. Hawk's fingers twitched slightly at the memory, and he opened his eyes. The past was gone. It had been for a long time. But war had a way of following men like him. A knock at the metal door of his cockpit pulled him back to the present. Hawk turned, his sharp eyes meeting the figure standing just outside. Isabella. She was one of the few people in this place he trusted, or at least tolerated. A mechanic, barely in her 30s, with grease-streaked hands and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had been working at this airfield long before Hawk had arrived, and she knew the game better than most. "You planning to leave tonight?" she asked, arms crossed over her chest. "Thinking about it," Hawk replied, watching her carefully. She hesitated. "You should not." Hawk raised an eyebrow. They were asking about you again, she said, stepping closer. Same guys from the cantina, you pissed them off. He sighed. They will get over it. Isabella did not smile. No, they will not. These are not the kind of men who let things go. They think you are weak, old, a man they can use. Hawk studied her. There was something in her voice, something close to fear. You are worried about me? He asked, half amused. No, she shot back too quickly. Then, softer, I am worried about what they will do when they realize who you are. He said nothing. They are waiting, Hawk. You leave now, and they will follow. You stay, and they will come. Hawk exhaled. He had spent years avoiding fights like this, staying in the shadows, keeping his head down. But maybe he had been a fool to think he could outrun it forever. He glanced at his instruments, the dim glow of the controls casting long shadows in the cockpit. He could leave, right now. Disappear into the sky, find another airfield, another nameless town where no one asked questions. But something told him that would not be enough this time. You should go home, Isabella, he said finally. It is not your fight, she scoffed. You think you are the only one who has lost something to men like them? Hawk turned fully toward her now, studying her in the dim light. There was something raw in her expression. She had her own ghosts. Just be careful, she muttered before turning away. Hawk watched her go, then turned his gaze toward the desert beyond the airstrip. The night was quiet. Too quiet. An hour passed, then another. Hawk stayed in his cockpit, his senses alert. He had been waiting for something, though he was not sure what. Then he saw it, a pair of headlights, approaching slow from the road beyond the airfield. Another. Then a third. They did not belong to the locals. Hawk's jaw tightened. He reached beneath his seat, pulling out an old worn leather case. Inside, nestled in cloth, was a weapon he had hoped never to need again. A Colt .45, heavy, solid, a relic from another life. He checked the magazine, then slid it into place. Outside, the vehicle slowed, their engines humming low in the night. Hawk's grip tightened around the pistol. It was starting. Before Hawk could move, another figure appeared in the distance. Isabella. She was running toward him, waving one arm frantically. Then, a sharp, sudden noise split the air. A gunshot. Isabella stumbled, her breath catching, her body jerking mid-step. Hawk's heart seized. She collapsed onto the tarmac. His instincts took over. He was out of the cockpit before he could think, running toward her. More figures appeared from the shadows, moving quickly. Too many. It was not just a warning anymore, this was a message, and Hawk had just run straight into it. The headlights had long disappeared into the darkness, but the presence of Scarface and his men still lingered like a storm on the horizon. Hawk kept his gun raised for a few moments longer, listening to the desert breathe around him. The wind whispered through the cracks in the tarmac, kicking up small swirls of dust. Isabella groaned beside him, her breath uneven. Hawk holstered his pistol and pressed the cloth harder against her wound. She winced but did not complain. They will be back, she murmured. I know, Hawk replied. For a long time, he had convinced himself that he could stay in the shadows, that the world had forgotten him, but war never truly ended for men like him. It just changed battlegrounds. He looked down at Isabella. The blood soaking through her shirt made his jaw tighten. They were not here for you, she whispered. I know that too. Hawk helped her sit. Up, she was tough, that was why he respected her, but even the tough ones bled. Can you walk? Yeah. She exhaled. Not far. Then we are staying here for now. That is a bad idea. Hawk did not disagree. But if he ran now, Scarface would chase him. No. This had to end here, on his terms. They moved toward the hangar. Hawk supported Isabella. As she limped beside him, her breath shallow but steady. Inside, the overhead lights flickered, casting long shadows against the steel walls. The scent of oil and sweat clung to the air. Hawk set Isabella down on a crate and grabbed a med kit from his locker. As he worked on her wound, silence stretched between them. Then softly she asked, "Who are you, Hawk?" He paused. She had never asked before. Maybe she had not needed to. Maybe she had always known there was something about him that did not fit. He secured the bandage and sat back, exhaling. "Someone I buried a long time ago," he said finally. She studied him, her dark eyes unreadable. "You were a soldier." "Once." She nodded slowly. "And now you are just a cargo pilot." That was the plan. Humorless chuckle left her lips. "Some plan." Hawk looked at his hands. Scarred, calloused, steady even after all these years. Plans do not always work out. Her gaze did not waver. "And Scarface? What is his plan?" Hawk already knew. The cartel did not just want a pilot. They wanted him. They wanted a man who could fly under the radar, who could get in and out of places without being seen. They wanted a smuggler, a ghost in the sky, and they thought they could force him into it. He had seen it happen before, to men who had debts, men who had families. The cartel never asked. They took. But Hawk had nothing to take, and that made him dangerous. "You cannot fight them alone," Isabella said. "I do not intend to." She frowned. "Then what?" Hawk leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I am going to make them come to me." She blinked. "That is insane." "Maybe. But you will die." "Maybe," he said again. She shook her head, frustrated. "So that is it? You are just some old warrior looking for one last fight?" Hawk met her gaze. "No." "Then why?" He exhaled. "Because, if I do not, they will keep coming, and next time they will not miss." Silence. Then she said, "Then let me help." Hawk shook his head. "This is not your fight, kid." Her jaw clenched. "They shot me. That makes it my fight." She had a point. Hawk ran a hand through his silvered hair, considering. He had spent years avoiding this, but now there was no avoiding it. Scarface had already made his move. It was time Hawk made his. The next morning, Hawk stood at the edge of the airstrip, watching the sun rise over the mountains. The desert stretched, wide before him, golden light brushing against the dust and dry earth. His body ached from the fight the night before. His ribs were bruised, his jaw sore, but none of it mattered. Scarface would not wait long, and Hawk had no intention of giving him the advantage. A memory surfaced. His father's voice, low and steady. "When you know the wolves are coming, you do not wait for them to reach the door. You take the fight to them." Hawk had never been the kind to wait. He turned back toward the hangar. Isabella was already up, moving stiffly, her arm in a makeshift sling. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Not long," Hawk replied. She nodded, understanding. They both knew what was coming. Hawk grabbed a wrench, started checking the plane. He needed it ready. If things went bad, he needed a way out, but more than that, he needed a way up. Because when the time came, the sky would be his battlefield, and Scarface was about to learn a lesson men had forgotten. Legends did not die easy.